Hello and welcome back to my Yii 2 tutorial videos. I'm sorry that there's been such a long delay before releasing this video, but I've been busy with other things, and hopefully now that I've spent some time and looked into asset management, you'll find this video useful in your introduction into Yii 2. Now, I guess one of the things to say right at the beginning is that the Asset Manager and the document, which you can see on the hyperlink here in the guide about assets, is not really about bundling and minification of assets. So although that is possible with the Asset Manager, the primary use of the Asset Manager is to be able to pull in CSS, JavaScript, fonts, videos, any kinds of assets really, in a way that's programmatic. So that allows us to do things like a plugin can introduce its own assets without the programmer having to add these manually, and also to create things like dependencies and those kinds of things. So if you're looking for an easy way of getting bundling and minification, I'm afraid this is not it. But if you are interested and you carry on watching, then you can find out later how we do that using the Asset Manager. So one of the first things I want to do is I want to cover some background about optimizing assets, about optimizing CSS and JavaScript, and I want to go over that in some detail first. But if you already know about bundling and minification, if you already know about resources and performance, then please feel free to skip this first section. I'll put a link on the YouTube video at some point, so you can skip the section and then you can just go straight to the video part about the Asset Manager. So the background here is we are going to be talking about bundling multiple resources together. Now what's confusing here is the way that Yii 2 uses the word bundle is not really the normal way that we use the word bundle, because bundle is a very general word. And bundling on this slide, we're talking about combining several files into a single file in order to reduce the number of requests that a browser makes to the server. We're also then talking about minifying the content, so we'll look at that in a minute, and that just means reducing the size of the download, and again that's obviously going to make things quicker. We're also going to look at caching, and caching is something hopefully you are aware of, but caching is a way to avoid unnecessary server requests. So to avoid asking for a file that is never going to change or is not going to change very often, then we cache it in the browser, and that again speeds up the page load times. And the fourth thing we look at related to caching is how to do cache busting. And that's an issue that we come across when we set cache times that are too long, and then we change the resource that we've cached, and we want the browser to download it, but the browser wouldn't normally download it because it thinks that the object it has in its cache is still valid. So we're going to look at each of those things in turn fairly quickly. So bundling, as I've already said, we're not going to confuse it with the asset bundle. The asset bundle is another type of bundle which groups usually CSS and JavaScript files together into a single logical unit. But we're talking about bundling, which means putting multiple CSS files into a single CSS file, or multiple JavaScript files into a single JavaScript file. And bundling reduces the number of server requests that a site makes. So if we pop over to the browser here, and if we go to somewhere like, let's just bring up the developer tools. If you don't know how to use developer tools in your browser, whichever browser you use, then you really need to get to learn how to use it. It's so important and it's very powerful. You've got all kinds of tools here that help you see what's going on. But we're just going to look at the network tab, and the network tab is going to show us every request that the page makes or that the browser makes to a server and the responses of that. So I'm going to go to amazon.co.uk, and one thing that probably won't surprise you, but maybe it will, is that the Amazon content is very, very, very large. So you see there, we're still loading content. We're still at 13 seconds, and it's still not really finished. It's transferred 6 meg of data, so that's a fairly big page really. And that said that, look, it's still making requests. There's almost 300 different requests made to the server. Now Amazon can kind of handle that because they have a lot of processing power, but this is not a good way to design a site. If we pop up here and filter by type, if we look down here, we'll see that there are a whole load of JavaScript files. And although images aren't usually bundled together, they can be. Style sheets, loads of CSS. See, all of these are separate requests. And even though they're quite small and the actual size of the file is quite small, most browsers can only make about 8 requests to a server at one time, to the same server. So if all of these are coming from the same domain, which most of them probably will be, then the browser ends up slowing down because it has to wait for resources to load before it can even start loading the next ones. So clearly on Amazon they have a lot of scope for combining resources, combining CSS, combining JavaScript, but clearly their biggest problem is that they have way too many images on the page. And like I say, look, 300 requests down the bottom there, 6 meg, and that's kind of pretty much probably a worst case kind of page really. So bundling is saying I want fewer requests, because fewer requests is always going to be quicker when we're trying to connect between a client and a server. And if you think about your site, then remember this problem can be multiplied by the number of users that visit your site at the same time. So if you have 1,000 people on your site all making, let's say, 300 requests each, then your server has got to service all of those requests for all of those people. You're going to have network problems, you might have caching problems on the server, you could have database issues, all kinds of stuff if you're requesting things too many times. So bundling in Yii has to be done manually, but there is a way to automate it, which we'll kind of describe later on, but won't go into too many details. So then if we look at minification, so when we look at CSS and JavaScript files, I mean, we can show a couple, but I'm sure you know what they look like. So if we go under, let's say, web in our project and look at the site CSS, this is the standard way that CSS is written. It's easy to read. It allows us to debug it, allows us to see what's going on. So that's very useful for a human, but it's very wasteful because there's lots of carriage return line feeds, spaces or tabs in here. None of that's actually needed by the browser, but it's all in there for formatting reasons. And of course JavaScript can be even worse. I've got a JavaScript file here somewhere. That'll do. So if we look at some of these JavaScript files, you know, we have file names, function names and variable names, many of which are very nice to read by a human being, but again, they don't need to be text status to the browser. So Minification can take these files and perhaps it replace TS with text status with the letter T, and then that becomes T, and we start saving lots and lots of space in our files. And when we minify, I mean, one of the examples I looked at earlier was the bootstrap. The main bootstrap file can be reduced by about 50% in size without removing any functionality, just by minifying it. So minifying can be done on the fly. On some sites, what happens is it will pick up those JavaScript or CSS files, it will compress them on the fly and then send them out. But to be honest, that's probably not a great idea. Most of the time we can minify them statically, and you do that using a number of command line tools, or indeed you can do them online. There are plenty of websites, if you search for minify CSS or minify JavaScript, that will do that for you, and then you can copy and paste it into your project. And again, we can save a lot of space, and that lot of space means we're saving download time when people visit our page. So if we have another thing that's worth mentioning, I guess, at this point as well, if we look at the Bootstrap for an example, you'll see it's very common to have both a normal file, which is readable and usable and debuggable and very nice for a developer, but we also have the minified version, and you can see that apart from the fact it's got a header in it. This is pretty much one massive long line, and you can see all of these variables that have been shortened to single letters just to make it much smaller. And this file is half the size of that file, so it's quite a big saving. And what we can do with the Asset Manager is we can say that I want to use this readable version when I'm in development, and I want to use the minified version when I'm in production because it's quicker. Just a word of warning, although that is a common thing to do, you need to make sure that these two definitely match, because what sometimes happens is you'll have an error in production because of this file, but you won't be able to recreate it in your development environment because you'll be using a different JavaScript. So just be aware that can be a problem. You need to make sure that those versions match. And likewise, while I'm there, the versions of Bootstrap CSS need to match the JavaScript versions. And there's lots and lots of problems people have when they update one of these and don't update the other one. So just be mindful of that. So that's minifying. Minifying is obviously going to make things quicker. The other thing that's worth mentioning as well is you can customize some libraries, things like jQuery, Yii, and Bootstrap. If we just have a quick look at the Bootstrap page, which is getbootstrap.com. One of the things that these sites often allow you to do is customize your download, and that's because they realize that a lot of these things do take up space. So you can customize. Less is used to generate CSS. If you don't know about less, that's a great thing to learn about, save you a lot of time. But even with jQuery, so they've got JavaScript plugins with, for different things like drop downs, modals, whatever. If you don't use a modal, there's no point including the modal JavaScript in your JavaScript. So what you can do on these customized pages is you can untick anything you don't use, untick your less files. In this case, you can customize your less variables if you want, and then when you get to the bottom, you compile it, download it, and you just get a slightly smaller version of the same thing. So again, that's worth thinking about if you have a site that is very heavily used. So we come to caching, and caching is really probably one of the most important ways of making your pages responsive. So specifically here, we're talking about the browser caching assets that it's downloaded already. Now, one word of warning here, the browsers sometimes do things that you don't expect. So browsers try to be helpful. Even if you haven't set up caching properly on your web server, the browser might well still cache certain objects for a short period of time. And that can get very confusing when you're trying to debug your cache settings. But just be aware that sometimes the browsers will behave slightly differently. And if something doesn't look right, it might be just because that browser is trying to be kind of clever. But we're going to explain caching really by showing you some example pages, and these are some of the pages I've worked on. So if we look at this page, this happens to be running on Yii, and if we go to the home page and we click that, you'll notice here, well, let's just do a full refresh to begin with. So Control F5 in Chrome, and you'll notice that it's called Get. There are not many items on this page, 10 requests. It's not actually a particularly slow page, even by requesting all of those, and that's because none of those files are particularly big. Most of these are probably minified anyway. But let's just click on one of these and see what the response was. So we obviously sent back the jQuery. But in terms of the headers, so we look at response headers, not interested in any of that. You'll notice, or you might not notice, but there aren't any caching control tags in here. So effectively, I haven't allowed this object, or I haven't really described how this object can be cached. Now, what the browser might still do is the browser might say, well, I'm still going to cache it for maybe 30 seconds or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So the browser kind of gets to decide that. But really, I've set up the server here to not cache anything. But what is interesting is I have given it this thing called an E tag. And an E tag is just a string. It doesn't have to mean anything, but it's a way of uniquely identifying this object. And the reason that's useful is when I re-request the page, what should happen, although I realized it wasn't happening on Chrome earlier, is Chrome should go back to the server and say, can I have jQuery.js, but only if this tag has changed? So what the server can then do is the server can have a look and say, oh, actually, this object hasn't changed, so I don't need to send you a new one. I'm just going to reply with a 304 response, and the browser will then know 304, great, I'll use the one I already have. If the server checks and realizes that tag has changed, then it can just respond with a 200, send back the jQuery.js, and then the browser can replace the one that it has. Now, I say that the E tag doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't, but what's common is to put either some form of date stamp or otherwise some kind of file hash in the E tag as just a very simple way of uniquely identifying whether a file has changed. But the problem with the E tag and the problem with the 304 response is the browser is still going back to the server and asking the server for those items, and then it's up to the server to respond with the 304. So we might be saving a bit of network bandwidth, but we're still making lots of requests. So that's not ideal. Now, I've clicked that page again, and I think this is quite misleading. If you noticed here, it says that all of these items have been pulled from cache. Now, they shouldn't have come from cache because they have no cache control headers. But I think what sometimes happens in Chrome is that has gone back to the server, and the server has given it a 304, and this reports it as a 200 code. So you notice that that's grey and that's black. Well, that's a bit hard to see. And you notice it's pulled all of those from cache. So that's speeded up our page a bit, but that should still have gone back to the server to request those objects. And like I say, it's very possible that Chrome's trying to be clever, and it's saying, well, why am I going to go back to the server when I've already got them in cache? So I'm not quite sure. I tried this on Firefox and something slightly different happened, but basically none of these items should be cached. So if we now compare that to what happens, here's another site, one of my sites, where the page is very heavily cached. So let's first Control and F5 to force it to get everything. Now let's look at what headers come back with some of these. So let's pull up, say, this CSS file. Now if we look at the response here, one of the things that you should notice is it has a cache control header. And that cache control header says you can keep this item for up to 1 year. That's the time in seconds, I think, of how long you can keep it. So in this site, I've set it to say you can have it up to 1 year, but we'll look at cache busting in a minute. You'll notice there's this funny query string on the end of the CSS file, and that's how we make the browser download a new one when it runs out, even if this one is still valid. And the reason this is quite cool is if I now go back up here and I load it again without forcibly reloading it, you'll notice that virtually everything on this page has come from cache. And because everything has come from cache, and we're talking about web fonts and all kinds of stuff which are quite big when they're first loaded, you'll notice here that even though there are 27 requests, I've only actually transferred 4.8K across the network, which is tiny, and that's only taken 220 milliseconds. So by using a caching, I've made this page incredibly quick. Look at that, it just flashes up. So clearly that's good for the customer, that's good for your web server, because I'm not going back to the web server all the time, and it's good all round. But let's just go back to here. So we've talked about all of that. So the question is at the bottom here, how do we tell the browser to reload the asset? So at the minute on this site here, if I refresh this page, the browser doesn't even ask the server whether these things are still valid. If it did, then there's kind of not much point in caching. So the question is now, how do I make this browser come back and get another pixelpin.css file or whatever, webresource.axt, it doesn't matter, whatever the type is. How do I get the browser to come and ask for another one? And the answer is this little string that's after it. So you see it has a query string. It looks a bit like a URL, ID equals, and then there's some data afterwards. And this works in pretty much the same way as we saw on the earlier site with the E tag. It's really just a way of uniquely identifying this resource. But the point is quite simply that if I need to change pixelpin.css on the server, then what happens in my case automatically is a different value will get stuck on the end, and then this page, if we look at the source, what would happen is, let's just pick one here, that script tag would be changed in my ASP page, and when the browser comes to read that, it will say, oh, that's not the same as the global scripts asset that I already had, because the query string's different. So the browser then comes back and requests another one, and the server will give it the new one. So we call that cache busting, and it's a trick, basically, a trick of telling the browser to come and get a new file, even though the name itself hasn't changed. So pixelpin.css, which is there, is still there, but by changing the bit after it, the browser realizes it's a different item and it comes back and gets it. Now, normally this is done automatically, and in Yii, this is the one thing that is done automatically by the Asset Manager, which we'll look at in a second. So by doing that, we can set long future cache headers. So we can set 1 year, it's not normally longer, set 1 year of cache, and then using the cache busting, we can get the browser to reload it. So that brings us then to our Yii 2 Asset Manager. Now, as I've said many times before, let's drag this over here if I can. Make sure you visit the guide. Okay, this guide here for assets, for instance, everything I'm talking about pretty much is all on this page. And I know it's long, and we'll cover it all in the video, but most of what I know is found on here, or a couple of times I've looked in the source code. But please don't go onto the forums. So many people still do it. They ask questions that are answered in the first sentence of the guide. Be familiar with the guide. Some of the stuff's a little hard to find in here in the way it's grouped, but again, it's got a search box. You can usually find it, and probably somebody's done a guide about whatever question you need to ask. But please start in here before you start asking questions. Otherwise, you'll probably just find that people won't answer your questions, or they'll tell you to go and read the guide. So we start in here. But one thing to kind of note straight off is that the Yii Asset Manager is not mainly about bundling and minification. So even though it sounds like it should be, it isn't. It's primarily about convenience, about organization of your assets, about managing assets in plugins, and about managing dependencies of assets. So that means if your plugin is dependent on Bootstrap, then rather than copying Bootstrap in, you can create an asset bundle, and you can say that your asset bundle depends on the Bootstrap asset bundle, and all of it will get pulled in automatically. So although we can do bundling and minification, we kind of have to do it a little bit manually. If we automate it, we have to automate it, most of it ourselves. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, and let's kind of start at the beginning. So there are 3 ways really in Yii that you can include let's just talk about CSS and JavaScript. It kind of works for fonts and videos and everything else, but because none of the fonts and videos and stuff are bundled or minified, then they're not really covered in the same way. So let's just talk about CSS and JavaScript for now. The first option, the most obvious one, is you can just put a normal link or a script tag, or use this render PHP file to do it slightly in code. So clearly in your view or in your HTML file, if you put link, style sheet, or a script type JavaScript, whatever you want, that's going to work. You get no real benefits to anything by doing it that way, but obviously it's going to work. It's valid HTML, and for a very simple scenario, that might be all you want to do. If you have a very tiny CSS file, then maybe this is just the quickest and dirtiest way to do it. So that's one way. Another way, so this is in module.php, which is a part of the debug toolbar. And this does something that's kind of manual. So if you notice here, they're echoing the tags, but instead of actually grabbing the file and putting it in as a link, they've actually included the contents of the CSS directly in the page. So they use, that's base view, I think, render PHP file, point it to a file, and that will take the contents of that. It's called render PHP file, but clearly it works on any kind of text file, and it will just spit the contents out of that into the string, and then that gets echoed out. So again, fairly manual way. Hopefully you know by now that it's not good to put inline script and inline style. Why? Because you make the page harder to read and debug, because you remove any ability to cache, bundle, or really minify any of those assets as well. So generally putting stuff inline like that's not a good idea, but again, sometimes you're doing something quick and dirty and you might want to do that. So the second way that you can include assets, JavaScript, CSS, whatever, is you can just call a fairly low level function, register.js file or register CSS file. And these are kind of fairly clunky. They just pretty much work. Let me find, I have one of these example. Not there. Hang on a sec. Register CSS file. So this is a slightly unusual one, really, the left menu here, because it's actually using the Asset Manager to publish a file. We'll look at publishing in a minute. But what it's then doing is it's registering that file directly into the view. And register CSS file, if you go to the documents online or if you go to the source code in NetBeans, that's Control B. There are also options you can pass to it. So you can say that my CSS file also depends on another CSS file. You can pass in options. We'll talk about the options later. But basically it's a fairly kind of simple and quick way of registering a CSS file. We can do that in code, so that's all kind of handy. I think the reason this file has done it this way is it's avoided the need to create an asset bundle. So we'll look at an asset bundle in a second, but to avoid creating one, then what they've done here is they've published it, grabbed the URL from the publish function, and then once they've got that URL, they've then found the file that they expect to be published in the assets folder, and then they've just called register directly. So again, fairly kind of quick and easy way. You'll get some of the kind of benefits of Asset Manager, but again, you'll have to do some of the stuff yourself. So if you've only got maybe one or two items that you're registering, then maybe this is the right way to do it. But you will lose all of the configuration options that you have in the Asset Manager, or some of them, because clearly here they're using the Asset Manager. But generally speaking, we'll probably only do this for very, very simple cases. Otherwise, we might as well dive in and kind of look at the Asset Manager. So the Asset Manager here is really the third proper way to do it. So what are the benefits of the publish model? So the idea of the Asset Manager is you configure a bundle, and again, don't be confused with bundling. This is really just a Yii word. You create a bundle which can include multiple CSS and JavaScript files, and then one of two things will happen. So if those files are already accessible by the web, from the web, i.e. if they're already in a web folder, like let's go back to our web folder here. So if one of those items in our bundle is, say, site CSS, well, site CSS is already under our web root. So nothing needs to happen to that file in order for it to be visible by our site. So by setting up our app asset in a certain way, nothing will happen to that file. On the other hand, let's look at something like vendor, well, whichever, Bootstrap. I don't know which one of these is actually used. Let's just say it's that one for argument's sake. Now this JavaScript file is not underneath the web root. So even if I publish this file in this position to my web server, it's not going to be accessible because the web root starts there and goes downwards. So what I need the Asset Manager to do for this file is I need it to publish it. And the publishing mechanism, quite simply, it happens automatically. And Yii, when you request this file in your asset bundle, Yii will see it. You will tell it that it's not inside the web root. So Yii will take it and it will publish it underneath web assets. So you see you've got all these files. They just have little alphanumeric names. And you can see the sort of stuff that's, so it's a Bootstrap one there, Bloodhound, whatever that is, jQuery, whatever. And you might see the same thing multiple times depending on how the dependencies are set up. So if two app assets pull in jQuery independently, then you might end up with two directories doing the same thing. But effectively they get published, so they're now visible underneath the web root. Now what's important to realize is because these folders are generated dynamically, you mustn't put your site, your CSS or your JavaScript files into the assets folder. They need to be in a separate folder, and if they get published, they will get published to assets. If you update plugins, again, the assets will be updated because the Asset Manager will see that the files have changed. And when it sees the files have changed, it will republish it and your page will get wired up automatically, which will be really cool. I think we should look now at some of the properties of an asset. So this here, ignore that bit down the bottom, that's an example for later. This here is the default Yii asset bundle for the Yii application. So what this says is my Yii app requires a Yii asset, which is under Yii web. So we can find that. That will be underneath the vendor folder. So if we look under vendor Yii soft here, web Yii asset. So Yii asset says, well, Yii requires jQuery. And so again, this is just a dependency path that will pull in the jQuery asset, which will be here, may or may not pull in anything else. So no. So at this level, all that the low-level jQuery asset says is my source path is underneath the Bower folder, and it's a Bower package called jQuery, and the folder is the distribution folder. So again, we can find these if you're interested, although you don't need to find them. But if we look under here, jQuery dist. So we're saying that I want all of the files out of that folder, and specifically I'm looking for, sorry, that's the source path, and I specifically want jQuery.js. So in that case, that's just one of the files out of there. So then if we go back up the tree again, what the Yii asset then says is I want a Yii.js file, which is found under Yii assets. Now that's the assets that's under here, not the assets under your web folder. But I also depend on jQuery. So pull in that jQuery stuff that we just looked at, and then also I need Yii.js. And this will be done in the correct order. So the dependencies will be pulled in first, and then that will be pulled in afterwards. And then if we go up one more level again, we're saying, right, all of that's going to happen. And then exactly the same thing will happen for Bootstrap. And then in my case, I'm going to pull in site.css and no additional JavaScript files. So you can see the dependency should be fairly obvious. Notice the namespaces. So your types, your assets have to be auto-loadable. And that usually means that the namespace needs to match the location of this file, and the file name needs to match the class name. So that's exactly the same as all the other classes in Yii, but they have to be auto-loadable. If they're not, then obviously that won't be found. You might get an error, or you might just not get your assets. I'm not sure what happens. So that's all fairly obvious, I think. So then let's talk about a couple of different properties that you can set. So if we set base path and base URL, we are telling Yii that our assets, not the dependencies, just our assets, are already visible underneath the web. So here we're saying our base path is web root. So if we start at web root, if we then look underneath the web root and look for CSS, we will find a file called site CSS, and there it is. Now, what the reason we tell it that the base path and base URL are in the web root is so that Yii knows not to publish that site.css. It doesn't need to publish it. Publishing is not going to change the file automatically, so there's no point publishing it. It's already visible in our website. If, in the case of, say, the ones we just looked at, which I'm now going to try and find again quickly. So if we look at here, we will notice that because in this case, the Yii.js file is actually under the vendor folder. So again, this is not under the web root and not visible to the web server. So this time we don't set base path, we set source path. Similar kind of thing, uses similar kind of aliases. In this case, the alias is at Yii, which I believe, if I'm correct, is this folder here. That one. And so it should find, I think it's that one, or wherever it is. It's wherever Yii.js is. Let's just find that so that we don't confuse you. It's not going to find it like that, is it? No, it's not in a comment anyway. Anyway, wherever Yii.js is. So you can use path aliases. It's going to look under the assets folder. But what's important about source path is you're telling Yii that it needs to publish this. It needs to copy it from wherever it finds it into the assets folder, which is under here. It will do that automatically. It will give it a number automatically, and when you use this bundle in your view, then it will automatically wire up the correct URL. So you don't need to know how it does that. It just does it automatically. Right. One thing that is probably worth mentioning at this point is with your dependencies here, the publish mechanism is obviously going to take an amount of time. Now it's only going to do it once, or it should only do it once. But if you're copying a lot of files, that is still something the web server's got to do. So for performance reasons, if your operating system supports it, you can set this property here to true. And what that will do is it will create symlinks from here back to the original file. So rather than copying it, it can create a symlink. Obviously, that's much quicker, so you can do that as well if you want. That's what link assets does. Sorry, I'm just reading my notes. Another thing that's worth mentioning as well is your asset doesn't just have to point to internal files. So your JavaScript could be an external file, in which case your base path wouldn't point to, say, web root or whatever. Where was it? So instead of doing a base path to here and base URL to here, you could also point your base URL to be googlefonts.com or something, and you could publish CSS or JavaScript or whatever from a web location, from a CDN or whatever. And again, by setting base path or base URL, then your app won't publish that asset, it will just link it directly. And why would you do that? Well, you do that because you still get all of the dependency functionality that you want. I think we've covered dependencies. So dependencies should be fairly obvious. Like I say, it will pull them in order. So in this case, when you include app asset into your view, it will first do the dependencies. So it'll pull in Yii asset, and again repeat any dependencies in Yii asset. Then it will add bootstrap asset, anything in bootstrap, and then it will add site.css afterwards. So it will be done in order, which you need to do because sometimes you will reference something in jQuery or bootstrap or whatever in your JavaScript. So it's dependencies first and then your own assets here. So one of the things that you can do when you add CSS and JavaScript is you can put options on there as well. Now, you can find that in the guide. So if we go back to wherever we were, the framework, let's just pop to the guide. and into assets. Asset options. So one of the properties that you can set in your in your asset bundle are CSS options and JavaScript options. You don't have to specify them, but if you put them in here like this, then as you might imagine, these will apply to every single CSS file that you define here. If you want to put different options for different files, then you need to split them out into separate assets, which is a bit of a pain, but that's just kind of how it is. So the CSS options, you've got various different ones. So condition in this case allows the CSS to be put inside some CSS conditional brackets. The example here is that's what it will do. And you've got similar things. You can set a no script thing for CSS. You can set positions for JavaScript. So do you want your JavaScript to go at the head, at the top of the body, at the bottom of the body? Again, we tend to put JavaScript as far down the page as we can. And that's because it allows everything else to load before it loads JavaScript. And JavaScript is sometimes the biggest things you're loading on your page. So you can set all those positions. If you want any more help on that, the options are described in different places. So if you look at the AssetManager documentation and the publish function, you'll find the details there about some of the options. If you look at the view, and that's the web view, not the base view. If you look at web view and the register.js file, you'll get the details for the JavaScript options. And if you look under the base HTML docs and the CSS file property, you will find the options for the CSS files. And like I say, there's things like condition, position. With the publish options, you can use things like only. So you could say I only want one of my CSS files out of that folder, not all of them. So you can do various different things. And by using some certain logic, you can also say maybe if I'm running debug, I want both of these files, or if I'm running release, I want both of them or one of them or whatever. So there's all the options there on the slide. We've already kind of looked a bit at Bower. So one of the things that sometimes it's quite difficult for newbies to get their head around, and I include myself here because I don't really know much about NPM and Bower. But there's kind of two levels of dependency here, and it's something it might take you a little while to get your head around. But if we look back at Bootstrap, now the Bootstrap here is a plugin. So if we look here at where this is, we will look and see that under the Yii, this is not under Bootstrap, this is under the Yii part of vendor, there is a package. Let's just go, where are we? Vendor, Yii Yii 2 Bootstrap. So this is all stuff that's basically created for Yii. So this is nothing really to do with the Bootstrap people. This is a Yii thing, but we have a Bootstrap asset, which is the one we're looking at here, which says that it depends on some stuff that's actually pulled in by a Bower package. So how would we do this in real life? Well, in real life, we use Composer to say what depends on what. So let's go up to our top level and look at this and just follow. This is purely source file dependencies. So forget about the website to begin with. This is really just files. So in here, we're saying that we require Yii 2 and Yii 2 Bootstrap. So we require the files for them. So when we run our Composer update on our whole solution, our whole project here, what will happen is that goes and it downloads certain things. So it's going to download Yii 2, and there's a lot of stuff in Yii 2. And of course, what happens when it downloads Yii 2 is Yii 2 will then say, well, I require PHP and MB string and blah, 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 and all these other stuff. So it downloads all of those. And because our top level project also requires Yii 2 Bootstrap, Yii 2 Bootstrap says, well, I require the raw Bootstrap that comes as a Bower package. So it downloads Bower. And what happens in Yii 2 is it all comes under vendor in the normal way. is it comes in here and it says I want Bower Bootstrap, and Bower Bootstrap obviously then downloads everything in here. So we've now got all of the file structure set up from that composer to that composer to that Bower package. But now then, how do we pull the files into our actual website? And that's where the app assets come in. So now what we're saying is I'm now interested in pulling these resources in so my website can see them. So we use the Bootstrap asset, is the one that comes from Bootstrap, and you look there, it has that special @Bower alias, and that @Bower1 unsurprisingly points to here. And we say that under Bower I want Bootstrap, I want dist, that's where I'm going to find my files. And in this case I want bootstrap.css, which is in there. And likewise, when the Yii asset, not Yii asset, when the app asset pulls in Bootstrap asset, that's all going to happen automatically, and all of that's going to be pulled upwards through this system as well. So when you're looking at packages, just remember you've got Composer and the files that you're actually downloading onto your file system, and then you have the asset bundle mechanism, which pulls all of those upwards from those files into your application. And in this case we actually bring in it's not there, well no, let's find the right one. App asset. Once your app asset is complete, we use it. In this case this is main, so this is under our layouts. So this pulls in app assets, app asset, which is that one, and then all we do is we call a static function register, we pass in the view, and then that all works automatically. So it's kind of, it sounds quite a lot of work, but it's not really, there's not really too much to it. Most of it works automatically. In some cases you might not be inside the view and you still might want to do this. So again, if that happens, you just need to find a reference to the view. If you're in a controller or whatever, if you're in a plugin, you might call this arrow view register. In fact, that's probably, let's see if we can find that. So you'll find in some of these plugins, is that in a plugin? Yep, so that's in a plugin, and you see that it finds an asset, it calls register, and in this case it's got the view. Because this is inside a plugin, it's got the view by calling get view, and it's passed that in instead. So you can do it outside of the view, but that register function needs a reference to a view in order to correctly link up all of those links and sources and everything else. So all of that's hopefully fairly straightforward. Now we're going to talk about different things that you can do in terms of configuration. So if you already know enough and you're not going to be doing anything clever, then you might want to stop watching the video now. But otherwise, I've got some example configs not in there. Oh, so I've closed it, I think, to find my other, oh no, it's in here. So here's some example things that you can set on the Asset Manager. So this is under components, like it would normally be under components. It's called Asset Manager. And in this case, there's several different things that we can do. So we're just going to go through these one after the other and describe what they do. As you're probably quite familiar with, Yii 2 allows you to override lots of things and customize lots of things. And this all works in a very similar way to normal. So underneath, actually, sorry, I've got some of these in the wrong place. Some of these need to be up another level. I just noticed. So some things we can do is we can override bundles. So in this case, when we create app assets, they get added automatically to this bundles collection inside the Asset Manager. So one of the things that we might want to do is we might want to say, well, we know that Yii Web jQuery asset is getting pulled in, and we know that by default it pulls in, let's say, a file from a vendor directory. And we don't want it to pull in one from vendor, we want it to pull in one from a CDN. So effectively, by setting this up in config, we're overriding what jQuery asset is doing, and we're saying is don't publish the stuff from the vendor, but get the JavaScript instead, just directly from the internet, from the CDN. So that's a very specific override. The reason we might do it in here, because we could obviously modify that file, but if we don't maintain that file and we update it, then we're going to lose our change. So this is a way of saying that wherever jQuery asset ever gets it from, I want it to come from here instead. So that's obviously quite a specific override. We might also want to do some conditional inclusion. So again, we might override that and say, well, okay, if I'm in dev, I want it to pull in jQuery.js, but actually if I'm not, I want it to pull in the minified version. So again, we can do that conditional stuff in here. It's not automatic. We would have to write the code to do that. But again, because of this override capability, we can do whatever logic we need to do to select the correct version of jQuery. So again, very specific override for that asset only. And that's the conditional logic. Another thing that we might do is we might say, for reasons that I'm not sure why we would do it, but we might say, I don't want this asset to pull in any files or any dependencies. I want to block it effectively. That might be useful if maybe we're trying to use a different sort of jQuery, maybe our own version, and maybe just a quick way of swapping between them is we might override this one and we might include our own one instead. So there might be a reason to do that, but by setting that to false, then we disable anything that the jQuery asset might be trying to bring in. So again, specific override. Now, however, and again, I'm not sure if I've got this at the right level. I think I haven't, so let's just assume I've got that in the wrong place as well. Is an asset map. Now the asset map is a little bit more low level, because what we're saying here now is, well, okay, I might be pulling in jQuery.js from lots of different places, but every time I pull in a file called jQuery.js, I want my application to use this one from the CDN. And again, I might do that for different reasons. It might be just a performance increase to stop the requests coming to my app for this file. But for whatever reason I do it, this will literally override every single time that jQuery.js is called. So that might be included in 5, 10, 20 different assets in my application. Every single one of those will map now to this. So that's a much more wide-ranging override. So this comes to about the only thing that performance-wise that the Asset Manager does do automatically, and that is cache busting. So not from the very first version of Asset Manager, but from I think version 2.0.3, this property was added, and what that will do is automatically add the timestamp of the asset into the query string. So although the asset the asset will still appear under here, and it will still look the same. It will still be called, whatever, jQuery.pjax.js. But when the link is actually included onto the page, into the view, it will automatically have the timestamp of the file added on the end of the link. And again, what that allows you to do is enable caching on your web server to cache those files for 6 months, 1 year, whatever. But by using the timestamp, it will be cache busted if you ever change the file, and if therefore the timestamp on the file gets changed. So that's quite handy to have turned on. I'm not actually sure if it's turned on by default or not. I haven't checked, but you can check that quite easily. And so that's cache busting. And another thing that is kind of built in automatically, but not quite, is the idea of converting assets. So some of you might have seen less files, and you might already use them, or TypeScript or CoffeeScript, or any type of scripting language that can be converted into CSS or JavaScript. And you might kind of think, well, I want to use the less files. I don't really want to use the CSS. I don't want to have to compile the CSS manually to use it in my app asset. Well, the good news is you don't have to. So in here, instead of site.css, if we had a less file, we could just put site.less in there. Question, what will the asset manager do with that? The answer is it uses something called the asset converter. And the asset converter has some default mappings set up. So it supports theoretically less, SCSS, style, and CoffeeScript and TypeScript. So they're the ones that are included by default. But what is actually included by default is not the full functionality. What is included by default is a configuration line that looks something like this. So by default, the asset converter will attempt to call less c on the command line if it finds a less file. It will call less c, it will take the source file, which in our case would be site.less, and then it will automatically create the output file that will be given to it by the asset converter. And in this case, it passes a switch, and these are the default ones. So I don't know how well these actually work and whether you could improve them. But what's important here to remember is that you need to make sure that less c is available on the command line. And if you use a different less compiler like winless or whatever, you would need to override commands in your configuration just like this, and you will need to set the correct command line to turn less into CSS, and obviously exactly the same turning TypeScript or CoffeeScript or anything else. You need to either install that command line application, or you will need to customize the command line in here to do it. So this is a good example of the kind of semi-automatic functionality that asset converter and that the asset manager does for you. So it will attempt it, but you need to make sure that the command line there, and most importantly with all of these things, just test it, see if it works, because if it doesn't, you know you've got something wrong. So notice here again, if you wanted to, you could actually change to a different sort of asset converter. If you only use less, maybe you would just use a less converter, and then all of this might be built in automatically. But by default, you can use the built-in one, and the built-in one will attempt to call the command line for you. So that's that bit, which is all good fun, but you may or may not need that. So that's that. And then the last topic I want to look at is bundling and minifying. Now, it's a bit of a shame, but the Asset Manager doesn't support this by default in Yii. So you kind of have to do it a little bit manually. Bundling and minifying we talked about before. So if you remember, we're saying we want to put multiple CSS files into a single CSS file and multiple JavaScript files into a single JavaScript file. Now, if we pop back to here, if we look at the source of this website, what we'll see is bundling in action. So in this case, we've got a load of scripts. I'm not sure why that frame busting one isn't included. It probably should be. But actually what happens in here is several scripts, or in this case it might just be one, have all been included into a single bundle, and that's been downloaded as a single request. And the same is their ASP.NET ones, so we'll ignore those. But if you look in several places here, you should see some more bundles if there are any more on this page. No, I don't know if there's any more on this page. But effectively, it enables us to bundle up the number of resources. And if we go back to here and look at the network requests, we should see that there won't be, let's scroll here, there won't be lots of separate scripts. Those two are separate because ASP.NET does that and we have no control over it. And you'll see here that I've only seemed to have two scripts, jQuery, which is included manually for some reason. I think it's probably from a CDN. And again, a couple at the bottom, global scripts, default scripts pulled in at different places. Notice the ordering of these, the ordering of the scripts coming right at the bottom, which means that the page can be loaded. But effectively, bundling and minifying is, as we said, a performance thing. So how does it actually work in Yii? The unfortunate answer is it kind of works a bit manually. So we're going to go through an example to describe how you might bundle. One of the first things you've got to do, and this can be quite hard to get your head around, is how many bundles of scripts do I want? So first off, if you can include scripts at the bottom of the page, then you should create a bundle for scripts that come at the bottom of the page. If some of those scripts have to come either at the top of the body or in the head, you will need separate bundles for those. So for example, very often you want to pull jQuery in first, and sometimes you will do that at the top of the body. And that's just because lots of things use jQuery, so you might pull that in the top of the body. You might pull in everything else at the bottom of the body. So you're going to need one bundle at least for every position in your document that you pull in your files. Now that's fine, and if you don't have many resources you're pulling in, then one, two, or three bundles might be enough. However, if you have a site that has many CSS or script files, you might further want to split them down. And in general, any scripts that change very rarely, put them in a bundle together, and any scripts that might get changed more frequently, put them in a bundle together. Now, why do we do that? We do that because we have to balance the invalidation of the caching of those items with the benefit that we get from caching. In the same way as the question of how long do we cache an item for, we're kind of saying if we've got lots of files that don't change very often, then by putting them together, hopefully we will never re-download that. We will put a 1 year expiry on it, it will never download again because those things don't change. If we put every single thing into a single bundle, then any time any one of those items changes, then that whole bundle is going to download again. So we lose the benefit of having things in a single package. So it'll take a little while to get your head round, but for now you can imagine that you've just got one bundle. Now imagine this is our app asset, and we, at the minute, by default, this was the default from Yii, we pull in Bootstrap and we pull in the Yii asset and we pull in our site CSS. Now that's great, but we might decide that actually, even though we're not pulling in jQuery directly in here, we might think actually Bootstrap, Yii and jQuery, none of them really change very often. So rather than just pulling in this stuff directly, I'm going to pull in a bundle instead. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, right, let's take site.css, let's take every CSS and every JavaScript file from all of these dependencies, and this is the manual part. I need to manually create a single CSS file, which I'm going to call bundle1 or something, bundle1.css, and I create a single JavaScript file, and I'm going to call that bundle1.javascript. And I have to do that manually. If I want to minify them, I have to minify them. I have to make sure they're all put in the right order. But what I end up with is a single file for CSS and a single file for JS. And now what I can do is I can, let's comment these out rather than deleting them. So now I'm going to change my app asset, and I'm now going to say, right, my app asset depends on bundle asset 1. Now why have I done this? Because obviously I could have found out where that's included, and I could have changed all of those to be bundle asset 1 instead. But this way allows us to not modify our view, so our view still looks for the app asset. But in this case, we're going to say, I'm not going to pull in anything myself, I just want bundle asset 1. And this is going to be a bundle that I'm going to define. So now we look below and we look at bundle asset 1. Bundle asset 1's defined in exactly the same way. There's nothing special here. The only thing that's special is I'm pulling in one combined CSS file and one combined JavaScript file. And obviously this bundle asset 1 would need to go in a file with the correct name. I haven't done that just to save time. But otherwise it works in exactly the normal way. But the benefit here is if any of my files like jQuery or whatever get changed, then I have to rebuild these. But once I rebuild them, then all of that will pull through automatically, because the AssetManager will notice that that the bundle has changed, and it will all pull it in automatically. So all of that is a fairly manual process, unfortunately. There is in the guide some text at the bottom about configuring the asset Yii tool, and the asset tool allows you to minify and bundle things together and all those kinds of stuff. But that's a command line function, and you would have to set that up manually. You could use a grunt script in your build. You could use a Bower script. You do whatever you're familiar with to run those things automatically, or you can just do it manually, combine them manually, create your bundle assets, and of course you could have several of these. You could have you could also have a bundle asset 2 if you wanted to, and maybe you would put one of them in the head position of the page. You might put one in the bottom position in the page. It's up to you. You could have as many as you like, but effectively bundling in this sense is not done automatically. You have to do it manually. So that's really let's just save that for now. That's really kind of all there is to say at the minute about the Asset Manager. So I just want to really, in summary, just talk about optimization. And there's a very famous, let's get out of this a second, there's a very famous saying that is, the first rule of optimization is don't. Now, that might sound like a funny thing to say, but what are we saying here is it's very easy as a developer, not just with assets, but with everything, to think that we know what is going to be slow on our application and what is not going to be slow. And one of the dangers that we find ourselves in is we start optimizing things too early. We start thinking, wow, that's a really big database query. Let's spend 2 days making it quicker. Now, the problem is if we don't actually measure what's slow on our system, then what can end up happening is we spend time fixing things that are not broken. We spend time speeding things up that are not slow. So it's really important that when we're looking at web app design, I mean, let's just take this page. It's an HTML page, but it might still work. So let's look at the network here and reload the page. So we look at here and we say, well, actually, we're getting a 304. So this has been set up to say, to take an E tag and then to say, only give me a new one if it's changed. So if we look here, we've got a very quick page, and we've got a 304. So that's all set up okay. So we might look at this and say, do you know what? Maybe somewhere on here, behind the covers, is some functionality, some resources, some JavaScript, some plugins. It could be anything behind here. And we might look at that code when we're doing our development and we go, look at one of our app assets or whatever. Let's dig one of those out again. Oh, there we go. That'll do. So we might be looking at this and go, oh, is that the right source path? Is our Yii.js been minified? Is it, have I bundled it correctly? Blah, 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 blah. We might be kind of looking at all those things in code. But when we actually look at the page, we might go, well, do you know what? It only takes 200 milliseconds. So if it only takes 200 milliseconds, there isn't a problem. There's no point wasting time speeding this page up. Now, clearly, if we got a site that has 4 million visitors every minute, then every single piece of performance is important. But for many of the sites that we write, we just don't get enough traffic for some of these things to be problems. On the other hand, if we go back to our amazon.co.uk and we look at this, then we can very quickly work out that there's far too many requests, far too many objects. We might look at some of the sizes of the objects. See, this is still loading, 52 requests, still going, 53. It's taken a long time. And we might say, well, actually, what's the problem here? We could look at file sizes and say, well, actually, none of them are too big. So, I mean, even the 420K one is okay because it's zipped. So that's coming across 84. So we might say size-wise, that's okay. We might say, right, bundling-wise, are we bundling as well as we could? And we might say, well, do you know what? We've only got on this page a couple of JavaScript files. Most of it's images and HTML pages. So do you know what? We can't bundle. Let's not waste time trying to bundle things up any better than this. But what we might say about this page is a couple of things. First of all, there are lots of 200s, which means caching isn't working very well on this page. All of these images surely should be cached, but they're not. They're all being refreshed, or maybe they're just getting changed all the time. There are no 304s here, so again there's an E tag problem. And if we actually look at some of these things and look at the response, we can say there's a response headers here. Look at that response. So it's got caching, there's no E tag, but there is a last modified date. So maybe these images are being cached, and maybe the problem is that Amazon changes all the images all the time. So every time I come to the page, I'm going to get different images. I'm not going to make use of the cache. But the point I'm making here is you have to look at these things and measure what's actually happening before you decide there's a problem. Because even if the first page, I mean, in case, no, I don't know if it says here, even if the total page weight is, I mean, here it's only 855, even if it was, I don't know, 4 meg. 4 meg's quite big, but if that's only the first request that's 4 meg and all of the other requests are only 200k, don't worry about it. Don't lose sleep on it. If it's not fixed, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And that's really, in summary, with all of the optimization part of what I've been talking about, is measure it before you decide it's a problem. And in terms of the asset manager, hopefully you've worked out now all of the things that you can do with it. And like I say, please go to the guide if you need any help. Comments, suggestions below are very welcome. But otherwise, I will see you in my next video.